Hi everybody, my name is Cole Bassi, and I'm going to be talking about nerds and geeks, where they come from, what are the differences, and how can you really tell, compare side by side, what they are. And yes, there is a difference, even though most nerds and geeks generally mix into both categories. Can you tell the difference? Yes, it is quite easy just by looking at the general culture of both. And we'll get into the culture of a nerd first. So, where does a nerd start? A nerd starts from Dr. Seuss's If I Ran a Zoo. According to Jim Burrows, it first appeared in the 1950s when Dr. Seuss wrote I Ran a Zoo, and he's depicted as an angry little man with a black shirt. And, and has long hair and has a beard, and, generally what you associate with the nerd now. And then in 1970s, it really changed, and it became an insult. According to Webster's dictionary, it is a nerd, a person considered to be socially awkward, boring, or unstylish. And this was extrapolated by society and became a general term for college students and academic majors. And that's really who was really focused on, was people who focused on academics, who focused on learning and knowledge and that type of stuff. Then in 1974, it was generally publicized, according to Emily Gordon, that when the Fonz called awkward kids nerds and called them geeky and unsocial, he said, "Well, that's what a nerd is. It's a type of geek. It's a socially awkward kid." And then the first depictions of nerds, during the 70s as well, that they kind of used to demonstrate this was Eugene Felsink in Grease, where he had the big glasses, the hat, and he wore the standard white button-up shirt. And then Steve Urkel in Family Matters was a big nerd, and big glasses, button shirt, overalls, just generally the dorkish type of person. And then go fast forward 10 years and you get the Breakfast Club's Anthony. That kid that wears a sweater, that's kind of always around, you kind of don't really notice him, but he's kind of like hesitant and everything. He grew up protected, and then, sort of becomes cool by hanging out with Johnny, gets coolified by hanging out with everybody else. And then Revenge of the Nerds, which was like, oh crap, the nerds are coming, the nerds are coming. And that's really what made nerds cool. And then there's current depictions of nerds, which is Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, and Bill Gates, very pronounced businessmen and visionaries. And then there's also the depiction now of Silicon Valley and how a nerd is one who works on technology and makes money. And then, it really goes into what now makes a nerd, where nerds are considered to only be fascinated with something, to have minimal interest in other non-nerd subjects, and to only be involved in small social circles where they're part of bigger social circles which have normal life and nerd life, but they keep them separate. And they usually buy anything nerdy, like a Star Trek mug or a Batman t-shirt. And what is it to be considered a nerd now is someone who, you gotta wear glasses, you gotta have a nice fancy smart watch, you need to understand technology, you need, your knowledge has to be very broad and very understanding. But how they're perceived is dependent on society. And what isn't a nerd then? What isn't a nerd is a geek, essentially. So, for example, if you watch Big Bang Theory, Sheldon is an example of a geek. A certain type of geek, actually, is what you call a science geek. But he also fits under the category of nerd as well, but he's mainly a geek. And how he fits under nerd is because he fits under nerd because he has an interest in things like flags and Dungeons and Dragons. He has knowledge about subcultures, but is mainly a science geek, as you can see by his profession and by the shirts that he wears. So what is a geek? Well, geeks are technically obsessive about something. They can't stop. The personal life mends with their monoculture that they involved in. So what's the monoculture? Well, it's called fandomism or geekdomism, where you're stuck in a geekdom and you're really a part of that society. So, how are you considered to be a geek? Well, to be a geek, you have to, usually it's depicted as you wear glasses, you have a pocket protector, you're kind of socially awkward, to yourself, you're reclusive, But to just be a geek, you just have to be obsessed with some sort of culture. So there's Glee geeks, there's the hipster chic geek, there's the Steve Urkel geek, there's a tech geek, there's a D&D geek, there's a Harry Potter geek. And it really is just obsessed with the culture where it becomes a part of your life, while a nerd will keep them separate. And generally, you can have a nerd be a geek, but a geek will always be a nerd in some aspects. Um, so Also, geeks are usually just only socially adept in their own environment when they're talking about the things that they like, but when it comes to things that other people like, they kind of generally push it to the side, and they're generally detached because they only are responsive to each other. And here's the geek family tree. So I'm gonna talk about the geek family tree. First, the term geek came from geeken, which meant a circus performer, then transferred into academic geek. Then, as I said, there's branches of geek that just go and travel down. So depictions of geek, Stranger Things is considered a geeky thing because it fits a certain niche monoculture. Role Models, geeky thing, it fits a certain niche monoculture. And Seth Rogen is a geek and he fits a certain comedy monoculture. And as the difference between geeks and nerds is, geeks associate everything with one hobby, and nerds will claim multiple hobbies and will generally have a very broad but separate from reality and hobby, while geek will be encompassing their hobby into everything that they do. And usually geeks don't pay attention to social trends within their hobby. They'll pay attention to what they are introduced to, while nerds will pay attention to social trends in the hobby. If the tech social trend is smartwatches, then a nerd will usually be opted to buy a smartwatch or buy a drone if that's in style. And then usually, what do geeks now wear? Well, geeks will wear anything from just normal shorts and a t-shirt to, button up and overalls, while a nerd will go out of their way to dress stylish and keep up with fashion trends. And, and generally how you can tell, just general statement, geeks usually try to come off as cool, hipsterish, but they don't really pull that off. Only nerds do, and geeks really come off as dorkish. That's generally how you generalize. Geeks are considered very dorkish. Nerds are generally considered very hipsterish.